Tutorial 1B. Further to the theoretical framework in last tutorial, today we are going to talk about the literature review on this research question. Is insufficient housing supply a cause of unaffordable housing? There have been many studies which have shown the correlation between immigrants and housing prices in New Zealand. They traced even back to the 1960s and found a high association between the two. But does it imply the high housing prices caused by insufficient supply of housing? The following literature shows that supply is just a response to price change subject to some constraints, and it's not only in New Zealand but in many other countries and cities. For example, this Grimes and Aitken 2010, they found that the responsiveness of supply to house price increases in New Zealand region over the 1991 to 2004 period. And indeed, in their model, they put housing supply as a function of the level of house prices and construction costs and land prices. In other words, the authors assumed that supply is a response to house prices rather than a cause. And in another articles by Learns 2018, he also shows that New Zealand regions with tighter geographic constraints or greater incidence of delays in processing resource consent had lower housing supply responsiveness. In other words, he still assumes housing supply as a response to house prices, but the supply responsiveness is subject to some constraint. And in this article, he found that geographical constraint or processing building consent constraint will affect housing supply responsiveness. Similarly, in another two papers, they also found restrictive land use regulations and a shortage of developable land would reduce housing supply responsiveness in US cities. So I would like to summarize all these 3 and 4 papers. Indeed, all of them agree that housing supply is not a cause to price, but just a response to house price changes subject to some constraint. And this paper would be very critical and important for us to understand about whether it's a cause or effect. Well, this paper in 2007 considered 10 countries or economies in Asia Pacific housing markets. And they found a positive association between land supply and house prices. So as I mentioned, this is a very strong test because if we find positive relationship between supply and price, that means supply is a response to price. While indeed the authors admit that the positive sign of the coefficient of land supply index is positive, which contradicts with their theoretical prediction because they originally thought that increases in supply should have a dampening effect on house prices. So they originally assumed that supply is a cause, but their empirical result confirmed that supply is a response to house price change. So interestingly, in the article, they admit about this important finding. The following is a direct quote. On a second thought, this may reflect an impact in the reverse direction. That is, higher house prices provide an incentive for developers to build up new residential property projects. So this becomes one of the most important articles which reject the hypothesis that supply is a cause of high house price, but it confirms the otherwise. That is, supply is a response to house price change. Another article in 2015 by Wang et al. And their paper's title is exactly our research question: is insufficient land supply the root cause of housing shortage? The empirical study takes Hong Kong as an example because Hong Kong has been the most unaffordable city in the world for 9 years. While their empirical results confirm that new housing supply is independent of the land supply by government, which means the policy of increasing land supply to increase housing supply may be ineffective. The logic is very simple and straightforward. Even if there are ample supply of land, but developers would adjust their housing supply according to the market situation. So developers are businessmen. They would not produce more than enough, and they have to achieve the highest profit. So this paper confirms these profit maximization axioms in economics, that land supply does not necessarily imply housing supply. Another articles by Li, Wang, and Zhang, also taking Hong Kong as an example to study the relationship between land supply and housing prices, and they apply a grandeur consolidative framework, and they find that there is no evidence supporting the claim that changing land supply via government land sale program would impact on housing prices. So another confirmation that land supply does not impose impact on housing prices. The last article that I would like to introduce today is by Bramley and Watkins, 1995, taking London as an example, and they put forward a new argument about the circularity. They contend that indeed more supply would lead to more demand, and that's what they call projection led to circularity. In effect, a self-fulfilling prophecy that building X number of houses in a given location would result in that number of households moving to that location. The more you build, then the more people will be attracted to come to the city because of better living environment, more job opportunity, better networking, and whatsoever. Right? They argued that the projection approach to planning is misleading. It is in fact not based on a neutral assessment of housing need. So all this literature confirmed our hypothesis that housing supply and then supply is a response to house price change.